Well, let's get into some of that with Behnam Ben Taleblu. He is the Senior Director of the Iran Programme at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies. It's a non-profit, a right-leaning think tank. Thank you for being with us. We have seen protests like this before in Iran. How would you compare this one historically to previous protests?
Great to be with you, Christian. Happy New Year. Just a small note, we're a non-profit, non-partisan, so we have no political orientation, but no doubt you could say I'm hawkish when it comes to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Looking at this past pattern of protest, this actually fits a larger story you and I have even discussed before about Iran's larger national uprising. You know, you could trace this back to December 2017, which really touched off a boom and bust cycle of protests in Iran, triggered by economic issues, social issues, even environmental issues, that pushed past the ballot box and the state-linked reform movement and looked to the street as the best possible way to get political change in that country. And yes, this one was touched off by an economic concern, but has been sustained, and there's been a contagion effect across the country. All 31 provinces have experienced some level of protest and unrest, and that's because this national sentiment is shared by all of the street against the state. So what makes this different, first and foremost, is that it's an intensification of the trends we've seen in the past. Mm-hmm. The second, of course, is that despite experts saying post-12-day war, there would be a rally behind the flag or around the flag, you've seen Iranians even burn regime flags on the street and erect the pre-1979 flag. And certainly if you zoom out even further, this is the first major sustained wave of multi-city, multi-day protest since the Women Life Freedom Movement of 2022-2023, which were violently repressed, and just goes to show you the resilience of the street. And this should be setting off alarm bells for Western policymakers, because there is no proper Iran policy that doesn't take into account the street.
The internet blackout and the fact that the phone lines have been cut speaks in and of itself of the concern there must be within regime circles. Does the fact that it is or it was touched off by the fall in the currency and the economic problems within Iran speak to the difficulty the regime has in seeing off the protest?
It does, but make no mistake, the regime has actually suffered from an economic trigger for a protest that it's met with violence after it's done a digital blackout. In 2019 comes to mind. The regime occasionally talks about doing things like economic surgery to generate more revenue, transfers that pain onto the population. The population uprises. That develops, again, a contagion effect, and then the regime turns off the internet, cuts phone lines, throttles the internet if it doesn't shut it off nationally, and then meets protesters with brute force. So my great concern here is that in periods of nationwide or localized blackout, that's when you're going to have the most violence. And I don't mean just killing. I mean arrests, I mean detentions, and I mean some of the most grotesque things like targeted pellet guns at people-sensitive areas and all the rest.
President Trump says he's watching, and clearly there will be a conversation ongoing within the White House as to what to do next. If they were to strike the regime in Iran, would it be the nudge that might bring it down?
It depends. You know, I don't think President Trump would rush to embrace the military option, particularly when he hasn't maxed out his own maximum pressure policy. For example, they've talked about, reducing Iranian oil exports, because after all, that's the place that the regime generates the generates the revenue to fund its guns and fund its repression apparatus. And a significant amount of that oil goes to China. And I don't think the Trump administration has a problem ruffling Chinese feathers. The problem is, of course, they have not replicated the strategy you see with Venezuelan tankers, confiscating them, as you have with Iranian oil tankers. So that would be a step I would recommend before needing to discuss military action. But nonetheless, there are also cyber and covert means here as well. They could try to blind the regime's paramilitaries. They could try to hack into the national grid. You already see Iranians bravely in the videos that came out before the internet protests try to climb electric poles and street signs to try to physically remove surveillance cameras. If there's a digital way the president could, level the street and the state, the playing field, I think Iranians would reward him for it, especially when they're already changing street signs in Iran to put his name on it.
Behnam, always good to talk to you. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.